One of the most frequent questions I got after reading more than 400 fantasy books and having the Fantasy Booktube channel for almost 3 years is how you got into fantasy, and especially how can you get into fantasy. So today I crafted a list of 20 fantasy books that I believe are perfect to get you into fantasy, and I divided these based on different subgenres because I really believe that depending on your strengths as current readers or what you're seeking, you can get into fantasy. We will see cozy fantasy, fantasy romance, historical fantasy / magical realism, and also finally epic fantasy. And I really hope I help you with this one, so let me know by the end if I made good. Starting with cozy fantasy, because one of the main things that I usually hear when people are leaning to start with fantasy is that perhaps the world building, it is too complex, that there's a lot of different points of views, there are so many things going on that it sometimes might feel overwhelming. Well, there's this new line of fantasy that it's emerging and that it's here to stay, that is conquering the hearts of a lot of readers, and that is cozy fantasy, which usually implies that we will have a world building that it's well done, but that you will be narrowing down onto this village or into following just our characters, and there's usually these stakes that are a little bit lower, but that still it's a very fulfilling story. And in here I have 5 absolute gems, starting with a classic of cozy fantasy, which is the first story that I read, and I reckon a lot of people also was the first book that they read. It was written by this author, and he is a narrator, and he said that he wanted to also have a story that had all the beauty of fantasy, of this world building, of these characters that are fantastical, but without the high stakes, and instead made Legends and Lattes, which is an absolute hit. It's precious because it takes this very fantastical creature such as an orc, and she was a warrior, but she is tired of that life, and instead she wants to open a coffee shop. It's a beautiful story that follows very entertaining and cozy characters, and I really recommend. Next we have my favorite cozy fantasy, and it's a story that I've reread already, and I think it is truly perfect if you're seeking something for your soul. It's not only something that will get you a little bit uplifted, but it's something that really will make you reflect about life, about passion, about what's your purpose in life. And I absolutely loved the underlying idea, but also the relationships between our main character and the robot, and that is A Psalm for the Wild built by Becky Chambers. This belongs to the subgenre of solar punk within sci-fi, and it also has some fantasy elements with gods, so it's a little bit of a weird blend here. But what makes this book so great is that instead of having this apocalyptic future, yes, something terrible happened in the past, robots rebelled, but society has not gone down, they have connected with the land, and they are now seeking their true purpose, and it is beautiful. Another story that it was so perfect because it leans a little bit into dark academia, so I think it's also a beautiful opportunity for you to discover if you like our characters, loving more the proper idea of researching and discovering the land. And in here we have also this dynamic of characters that you have this tension, there's just a slow burn, but you blend that with this research in a northern land where you have this frosty climate, and it is a beautiful story, and that is Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies. This belongs to a series and it isn't concluded, but yet each story still reads as a very fulfilling, almost a standalone kind of story, and it will allow you to discover the idea of fairy, which is a really typical creature within the fantasy genres, while discovering dark academia. It's a perfect blend. The next book took me absolutely by surprise because it's not only cozy, but it has the best humor, and it's a slightly dark. So this goes for all of you that really enjoy dark fairy tale-esque foresty settings, but also humor and characters that are really brave and compelling. And then we have our story that it is very short, it's a standalone, but nonetheless will give you a lot. You have this woman that is able to do whatever it takes to save her sister, and that is Nettle and Bone. We also have an animal companion here, which it took me some pages to understand what was happening because it's a little bit creepy, a little bit weird, but I promise you it will pay out, and it is really a great read. If you like that blend of humor plus dark setting, also a quest, which is a trope that I absolutely love in fantasy, and I loved how this was played out with the different dynamics, the humor, the romance a little bit. just perfection. And we conclude this part of cozy fantasy with a story that it's not as cozy. Yes, it will give you tears of happiness, but there's also so much going on. But yes, in essence, this is a story that feels like a hug. If you need a hug, but it's a story that will just give you happiness and you want something great in your life, then pick this book, because what you will see are characters that are really charismatic, a wide variety of them, and they are unforgettable. And that is The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This author has the perfect blend of dark humor, but also very intense emotions, and a theme that underlies that it is fairly serious. So it's a weird blend, but nonetheless, it's phenomenal. We will be following this middle-aged man that is in charge of taking care of these magical children, and he's tasked to take care of the most dangerous children of them all. And you will see the devil, you will see his pride, a small werewolf, a blurb. That it is so amazing. And for a lot of readers, this has been the beginning to keep reading more and more of fantasy. We will move to stories that are perfect for those of you that either come from the romance side or that you enjoy the relationships. These stories usually have a restricted number of points of view in this story, and although most of them have a really good fleshed out magic system and world building, the main point of the story is the relationships, and that is fantasy romance. And we will start with the jewel of the crown, and that is A Court of Thorns and Roses. I don't believe this is a story that it is for a lot of you. It is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, but the story really pays off in book 2. It has a lot of those tropes that we came to love. We have this fairy love. There's a little bit of love triangle also involved. I think one of the great things that Sarah J. Maas was able to conquer with this book is that the fantasy element, how well crafted the story is, and how great the stakes feel, and how much you will feel for our characters. It's unprecedented. There's a romance that it's made the delights of a lot of readers. Next, we continue with a favorite of mine that leans more towards the politics than actually the fantasy element. There's a lot of I don't trust him and he doesn't trust her, but nonetheless they is forced to marry, and something needs to be unfolded from this, and that's the Bridge Kingdom. This story has the right amount of spice. It has a slow burn, but it also has this really political element. There are these different kingdoms, everyone wants to win, and what's the stake? It's not only the hearts of our characters, but the people. Next, we go to a young adult story that is still unfinished, but it's one of my favorites. It is so well done. Even if you would like to get into adult fantasy, this is a perfect story because it really has a rich and complex world building, but it drinks from Arthurian mythology, which I think will make it a little bit easier for you to digest. And it also blends a new magic system, which is phenomenal. It has a little bit of a love triangle that, yes, makes this story to be incredibly bingeable. And that is Legendborn. It is not super easy at the beginning because it goes on and on and on about the science, and it's trying for you to really understand what is happening. You will be following our character that is getting into the world as you are, but it pays off so much. It has such a great blend of romance, of pining, but at the same time, great magic, great plot, and it is surprisingly emotional because our main character is coping with her mom's death. So check all of the trigger warnings first. Editing is here. It seems that I forgot to add a book into this list, and it's not because I don't love it, it's because I have a terrible memory, and I was so excited that I just continued with other books. This is one of those stories that lean also towards the coziness, and it's perfect because of the vibes. It's the story that will conquer your heart because the surrounding, the setting in itself, it's beautiful, it's really full vibes, but also the story and the characters are really compelling. They have these really silly dynamics where you see a slow burn in one side, but also you see this humor, and thus at its core the story of the chosen one. There's a little bit of a quest, and that is An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson. This is a fantastic standalone. It is fairly short, it is young adult, and it reads like a charm. It is honestly one of those stories that once you read it, you feel for the fae in one hand, but also you will have this quest that it is wonderful. And last in this category, we have a story that has become viral precisely because because of how addictive the story is. It is very easy to read. It has sentient dragons, a military academic setting where our girl will need to face different trials, and you will be able to taste a little bit of that fantastical element, also to see if you like military academic settings, because if you do, there's so much going on that you can also bring from there, and also see if the romance, that it's a little bit more steamy that we've seen before, is what compels you. And that is Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. If you haven't heard about this story before, just know that it is making the delights of adult, young adult readers, male, female, everyone is reading this, and a lot of people is really enjoying it. I myself can say that I was really addicted to this story. It's not my favorite of all time, but I think it's a perfect gateway if you want to enter into fantasy. Now we go to stories that belong more to the historical fantasy / magical realism side of things, because I believe that it's perfect to get into fantasy because it has this world that really resembles something that we know, but it just enters elements that make this story stand out. It's a little bit magical, and that's what makes these stories really easy, in my opinion, to get into fantasy, and are nonetheless very, very easy and compelling and addictive to read. And we will start with a story that follows dragons, and these dragons are set in the Napoleonic Wars, and it has a lot of How to Train Your Dragon vibes. There's this humor that it's at its core, and all in all, it's a story that feels short, that it is action-packed, and that is very easy to read, but very fulfilling. And it also is almost a happy book, and that is Temerary by Naomi Novik. This author is incredibly gifted. She is able to craft stories that are so different from more advanced stories as perhaps Spinning Silver to this story. She always crafts worlds that are very rich and characters that feel fleshed out. I cannot recommend her enough. You can also pick a standalone that is rooted in Greek mythology and that will capitalize on your feelings. This story has the perfect blend of action while being very, very focused on the life of one character, and you will see how she advances since she is a girl until she becomes who she is. And it is a fascinating ride, full of emotions, full of Greek characters that if you know them, you will be delighted. It feels so important. It's a story about the power of women, about the power of witches, and that is Circe by Madeline Miller. This author also wrote the Song of Achilles, which also works on your emotions and the Greek mythology. But this one really, I think it's great because it's a story that I don't believe is as popular, but still it will display a lot of things that you might heard about, which will keep this story fresh, unique, and very, very compelling. But if you're used to read more historical and you want something that feels more serious, that it's way more military, more war-driven, then I have the perfect story for you, because it will capitalize on elemental magic. It will have a little bit of dark academia at the beginning, but it will quickly become a dark story, a war story, and you will see gray characters. This is really at the top of having a character that it's not likable, so it will also allow you to see if you like your characters gray or how much do you like your characters to be, you know, questionable. And that is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. This story made me so angry. It's really playing on your emotions. This author will always display a special amount of craftiness in order to make you feel all the most intense feelings. Once I finished this trilogy, I throw it. I did not want to see anything again. And then I realized this is one of my favorite series of all time. It feels more complex, but depending on your previous reads, I think this will be phenomenal. Shifting then a little bit into magical realism, we have this side of fantasy that will allow you to discover stories that are really rooted into your day-to-day, but that are magical, that are whimsical, and that will allow you to feel that magic. We will start with a story that especially will follow this man that then, you know, goes back to his house when he was a child and he rediscovers his childhood. It is horrifying, it is sad, it is amazing, it is happy, it's a blend of weird emotions, and I cannot recommend more. This is small standalone. It's such low commitment that it is very impactful, and that is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. This author has a lot of incredible standalones, so once you start with him, you can really pick that line. There are stories that are more into the magical realism, but there are others that go way more into the fantastical side, and it's a story that feels unique, that feels transformative, and I really recommend. Another story that feels unique and fresh, and that will play with your mind, and it will make you, doubt everything, and it's more rooted into the thriller, mystery, almost side, is this story that it's very short. It just will follow this one point of view that will write everything that he sees, which makes it for a very, very weird story, but it pays off. It is amazing, and what you see will blow your mind, and that is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This story, it's weird because it is written almost as in it was a scientific method. So not your usual cup of tea in fantasy, but it is really low on that element, and you still will see how this character lives in this house that is as massive as the world, and you don't understand, and he does not either, and you will follow little by little. It is short, it is addictive, and it is wonderful. And getting into epic fantasy, for all of you that want that amazing world building with characters that are complex, different POVs, expanding a lot across the land and across the books, this is for you. And the first book that I will recommend, it's been mentioned by a lot of different booktubers as well as one of the best books to get into fantasy. And although I don't necessarily feel the books in this category are easy, they are perfect to get a lot of readers into fantasy and have engaged a lot of readers. So trust me on this, because the first story is what made me really fell in love with fantasy. I discovered this magic system that it was also very weird. It felt terribly unhealthy and not sustainable, but I was blown at the idea of having a heist, but also having these characters. We have balls, we have a little bit of romance, but we have these different things. People can almost fight, and they can persuade you and change your emotions. That was mind-blowing. And yes, I'm talking about Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. This is a trilogy, but first book almost feels like a standalone. So if you want to start reading and discover if this is your cup of tea, cannot recommend this more. It has a lot of everything. Characters that are nuanced, but you have this hero. There is a fantastical array of elements here that I promise you will love. Next, we have a hidden gem that belongs to my favorite series of all time, and I think it will be great for you as well because it has sentient dragons, has a rebellion that it's brewing, but especially because of the characters feel so relatable, and you will follow how they need to take destiny and become who they are while fighting. They are incredible friends, but at the same time their backgrounds could not be more different, and it's a story that kind of blends very important society problems with dragons, with war, with an uprising. The Aurelian Cycle by Rosaria Munda with the first book, Fireborn. Adore one of the main characters, Annie. I felt for her so much. I feel the way in which this author was able to craft the emotions, the pains, the internal struggle that she passes was so well done, so emotional. I felt so seen, and I loved this beginning to end. I cried like a baby as the trilogy concluded. I really recommend. Editing is here because I also forgot one epic fantasy story, and in this case I have one that it is fantastic. I read it some time ago and I was not super fan of it, but I reread it and I fell in love with this story. It's the perfect heist. The characters are great, they're charming, the humor is off the roof, and it's a story that will allow you to see heist at its best. Also characters that are fairly grey, these family found vibes which I adore in fantasy, and I believe this band of misfits, it's particularly one of those high points in fantasy. In this is The Lies of Lord Glamora by Scott Lynch. This is a story that it's not necessarily super easy because you will have flashbacks, which is also something that you will very easily see in fantasy. So it's also a way for you to understand if this is something that you like. But the special thing here, it's the characters, how nuanced they are, but also how funny. And the stakes are so high. I was addicted to this story. So we also believe that if you want to start fantasy, this is one of those stories that will make you fall in love with it. Next, we have a story that leans more towards the slower side. It is not as action-packed, but it still has made so many readers love the genre because of how compelling the main character is. It's a little bit of a soft magic system. There's also a little bit of dark academia. And in essence, we have the story of the greatest magician in story told by this magician. And that is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This story, it is not concluded. And there's a lot going on with the author. It beautifully describes the journey of this character and how you see what are the different things that he passes. We have different lands and the number of points of view that you will see are limited. This was not for me particularly when I read it, but still I acknowledge the amount of people that fell in love with this story, and I know I'm not failing you here recommending you this one. And last here we have a story that I don't consider necessarily easy, but it is so addictive and it is so good and it is so well crafted that when I read it for the first time I fell in love. I was not able to stop thinking about this story. I made theories on how this will continue, and although it is also unconcluded, I bet you've heard about this story before, and that is Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. It is a story characterized because of the wide variety of these different houses that are fighting for power, and there are two main things in this story that are absolutely nuts. The first one is that you won't be able to stop reading, but you will want to stop reading. A lot of shit goes down and you won't believe what you're reading. And the other one is that there's no character really that it is bad. There's perhaps one or two, but it's not the main thing here. All of them are nuanced, all of them are grey, and that is a fascinating thought. And it was the first time that I encountered characters that were so well crafted, that were so twisted, felt so realistic, and I love this story. Cannot recommend more if you're starting with fantasy and you're not scared of a lot of characters, a lot of houses, and more of a political story rather than a very action-packed story. I hope I've helped you. Let me know down below. And if you like this content so far, consider joining my Patreon. We have a book of the month. Currently, we're reading The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. We have reading sprints. We also have the Wheel of Time read along, which is a massive series. We have game nights, and it's a cozy fantasy community that cannot wait to welcome you.